This lecture is dedicated to Nelson Mandela. A rather curious scene, unscripted, once took place in the wings of a London theatre at the same time as a scheduled performance was being presented on the stage before an audience. What happened was this. An actor refused to come on stage for his allocated role. Action was suspended. A fellow actor tried to persuade him to emerge, but he stubbornly shook his head. Then a struggle ensued. The second actor had hoped that by suddenly exposing the reluctant actor to the audience in full glare of the spotlight, he would have no choice but to rejoin the cast. And so he tried to take the delinquent actor by surprise, pulling him suddenly towards the stage. He didn't fully succeed, so a brief but untidy struggle began. The unwilling actor was completely taken aback and deeply embarrassed. Some of that tussle had been quite visible to parts of the audience. The performance itself, it should be explained, was an improvisation around an incident. This meant that the actors were free, within the convention of the performance, to stop, rework any part they wished, invite members of the audience on stage, assign roles, and change costumes in full view of the audience. They therefore could also dramatize their wish to have that uncooperative actor join them, which they did with gusto. That actor had indeed left the stage before the contentious scene began. He had served notice during rehearsals that he would not participate in it. In the end, he had his way, but the incident proved very troubling to him for weeks afterwards. He found himself compelled to puzzle out this clash in attitude between himself and his fellow writers and performers. He experienced, on the one hand, an intense rage that had been made to appear incapable of confronting a stark reality, made to appear to suffer from interpretative coyness, to seem inhibited by cruel reality, or perhaps to carry his emotional involvement with an event so far as to interfere with his professional skill. Of course, he knew that it was none of these things. The truth was far simpler. Unlike his colleagues, together with whom he shared, unquestionably, the same political attitude towards the event being presented, he found the mode of presentation at war with the ugliness it tried to convey, creating an intense disquiet about his very presence on that stage, in that place, before an audience whom he considered collectively responsible for that dehumanizing actuality. And now let us remove a little bit of the mystery and make that incident somewhat more concrete. The scene was the Royal Court Theatre, London, 1958. It was one of those Sunday nights which were given to experimentation and innovation of that remarkable theatre manager-director, George Devine, whose creative nurturing radicalized British theatre at that period and produced later icons like John Osborne, N.F. Simpson, Wesker, Bond, Harold Pinter, John Arden, etc., and even forced the conservative British palate to sample stylistic and ideological pariahs like Samuel Beckett and Bertolt Brecht. On this particular occasion, the evening was devoted to a form of living theatre, and the main fair was titled 11 Men Dead at Hola. The actors were not professional actors. Indeed, they were mostly writers who jointly created and performed these dramatic pieces. Those with a long political memory may recall what took place at Hola Camp, Kenya, during the Mau Mau liberation struggle. The British believed that the Mau Mau could be smashed by herding Kenyans into special camps, separating the hard cases, the mere suspects, the potential recruits. They had it all worked out. One such camp was Hola Camp, and the incident involved the death of 11 detainees who were simply beaten to death by camp officers and warders. The usual inquiry was set up, and it was indeed the report which provided the main text on which the performance was based. We need now only identify the reluctant actor. And if you have not already guessed that by now, it is none other than the speaker. I recall the occasion as vividly as actors are wont to recollect forever and ever the frightening moment of a blackout, when not only the lines are forgotten, but even the actual moment in the play. The role which had been assigned was that of a camp guard, one of the killers. We were equipped with huge nightsticks, and while a narrator read the testimony of one of the guards, our task was to raise the cudgels slowly, almost ritualistically, bring them down on the necks and shoulders of the prisoners under orders of the white camp officers. A surreal scene. Even in rehearsals, it was clear that the end product would be a surrealist tableau. The narrator at a lectern, under a spot, a dispassionate reading, deliberately clinical, letting the stark facts reveal the states of mind of torturers and victims. A small ring of white officers, armed. One seizes a cudgel from one of the warders to demonstrate how to beat a human being without leaving visible marks. Then the innermost clump of detainees, the only weapons, non-violence. They're taking a decision to go on strike, refuse to go to work, unless they obtained better camp conditions. So they squatted on the ground, refused to move, locked their hands behind their knees in silent defiance. Orders were given. The inner ring of guards, the blacks, moved in, lifted the bodies by hooking the hands underneath the armpits of the detainees, carried them like toads in a state of petrification to one side, divided them in groups. The faces of the victims are impassive. They are resolved to offer no resistance. The beatings begin. Once to the left side, then the back, the arms, right, left, back. Rhythmically. The cudgels swing in unison. The faces of the white guard glow with professional satisfaction. Their arms gesture languidly from time to time, suggesting it is time to shift to the next batch or beat a little more severely on the neglected side. In terms of images, a fluid, near balletic scene. Then the contrast, the earlier official version, enacting how the prisoners were supposed to have died. This claimed that the prisoners had collapsed, that they died after drinking from a poisoned water supply. So we staged that also. The prisoners filed to the water wagon, gasping with thirst. After the first 2 or 3 had drunk and commenced writhing with pain, these humane guards rushed to stop the others, but no, they were already mad with thirst, fought their way past salvation, and drank greedily from the same source. The groans spread from one to the other, the writhing, the collapse, agonized deaths. That was the version of the camp governors. The motif was simple enough, the theatrical format a tried and tested one, faithful to a particular convention. What then was the problem? It is one, I believe, that affects most writers. When is play acting rebuked by reality? When is fictionalizing presumptuous? What happens after play acting? One of the remarkable properties of that particular theatrical convention I've just described is that it gives off a strong odor of perenniality, that feeling of, I have been here before. I have been witness to this. The past enacts its present. In such an instance, that sense of perenniality can serve both as an exorcism, a certificate of release, or indeed, especially for the audience, a soporific. We must bear in mind that at that time of presentation, and to the major part of that audience, every death of a freedom fighter was a notch on a gun, the death of a fiend, an animal, a bestial mutant, not the martyrdom of a patriot. We know also, however, that such efforts can provoke changes, that an actualization of the statistical journalistic footnote can arouse revulsion in the innocent mind, in the complacent mind, leading to the beginnings of a commitment to change, redress. And on this occasion, angry questions have been raised in the House of Parliament. Liberals, humanitarians, reformists have taken up the cause of justice. Some had even traveled to Kenya to obtain details which expose the official lie. So this profound unease which paralyzed my creative will therefore reached beyond the audience. And finally, I traced its roots to my own feelings of assaulted humanity and its clamor for a different form of response. It provoked a feeling of indecency about that presentation, rather like the deformed arm of a leper which is thrust at the healthy to provoke a charitable sentiment. This, I believe, was the cause of that intangible but totally visceral rejection which thwarted the demands of my calling, rendered it inadequate, and mocked the empathy of my colleagues. It was as if the total inhumanity of which that scene was a mere fragment was saying to us, kindly keep your comfortable sentiment to yourselves. Of course, I outline that episode only as an illustration of the far deeper internalized processes of the creative mind, a process that endangers the writer in 2 ways. He either freezes up completely or he abandons the pen for far more direct means of contesting unacceptable reality. And again, Holekamp provides a convenient means of approaching that aspect of my continent's reality, which, for us whom it directly affronts, constitutes the greatest threat to global peace in our existence. For there is a gruesome appropriateness in the fact that an African, a black man, should stand here today, in the same year that the progressive prime minister of this host country was murdered, in the same year as Samora Machel was brought down on the territory of the desperate last-ditch guardians of the theory of racial superiority, which has brought so much misery to our common humanity. Whatever the facts are about Olaf Palme's death, there can be no question about his life. To the racial oppression of a large sector of humanity, Olaf Palme pronounced and acted a decisive no. Perhaps it was those who were outraged by this act of racial treachery who were myopic enough to imagine that the death of an individual would arrest the march of his convictions. Perhaps it was simply yet another instance of the terror epidemic that feeds today on shock, not reason. It does not matter. An authentic conscience of the white tribe has been stilled, and the loss is both yours and mine. Samora Machel, the leader who once placed his country on a war footing against South Africa, went down in as yet mysterious circumstances. True, we're all still haunted by the Nkomati Accord, which negated that earlier triumphant moment of the African collective will. Nevertheless, his foes across the border have good reason to rejoice over his demise. And in that sense, his death is, ironically, a form of triumph for the black race. Is that perhaps too stark a paradox? Now let me take you back to Holekamp. It is cattle which are objects of the stick or whip. So are horses, goats, donkeys. The definition therefore involves being occasionally beaten to death. If 30 years after Holekamp, it is at all thinkable that it takes the ingenuity of the most sophisticated electronic interference to kill an African resistance leader, the champions of racism are already admitting to themselves what they continue to deny to the world, that they, white supremacist breed, have indeed come a long way in their definition of their chosen enemy since Holekamp. They have come an incredibly long way since Sharpeville, when they shot unarmed, fleeing Africans in the back. They have come very far since 1930, when at the first organized incident of the burning of the passes, the South Africans decided to turn Dingaan's Day, named for the defeat of the Zulu leader Dingaan, into a symbol of resistance by publicly destroying the obnoxious passes. In response to those thousands of passes burnt on Kaapstad flats, the Durban police descended on the unarmed protesters, killing off some half dozen and wounding hundreds. They backed it up with a scorched earth campaign which dispersed thousands of Africans from their normal environment, victims of imprisonment and deportation. And even that 1930 repression was a quantum leap from that earlier spontaneous protest against the Native Pass Law in 1919, when the police merely rode down the protesters on horseback, whipped and shambogged them, chased and harried them like stray goats and wayward cattle from street corner to shanty lodge. Every act of racial terror, with its vastly increasing sophistication of style, escalation in human loss, is itself an acknowledgement of improved knowledge and respect for the potential of what is feared, an acknowledgement of the sharpening tempo of triumph by the victimized. But there was this aspect which struck me most forcibly in that attempt to recreate the crime at Holekamp. In the various testimonies of the white officers, it stuck out, whether overtly stated or simply through their efficient detachment from the ongoing massacre. It was this: at no time did these white overseers actually experience the human otherness of their victims. They clearly did not experience the reality of the victims as human beings, as animals perhaps, a noxious form of vegetable life maybe, but certainly not human. I do not speak here of the colonial overlords, the policymakers, the ones who formulated and sustained that policy of settler colonialism, the ones who dispatched the Maxim guns and tuned the imperial bugle. They knew very well that empires existed which had to be smashed. The civilizations had endured for centuries which had to be destroyed. The subhuman denigration for which their civilizing mission became the altruistic remedy was a mere rationalizing icing on the cake of imperial greed. But yes, indeed, there were agents. Those who carried out the orders, like Eichmann, to draw parallels from the white continent. They, whether as bureaucrats, technicians, or camp governors, had no conceptual space in their heads which could be filled, except very rarely and exceptionally, by the black as also human. It would be correct to say that this remains the pathology of the average South African white since the turn of the last century to this moment. Here, for example, is a frank admission by an enlightened, even radical mind of that country about his youth. It was not until my last year in school that it had occurred to me that these black people, these voteless masses, were in any way concerned with the socialism which I professed, or that they had any role to play in the great social revolution which in these days seemed to be imminent. The workers who were destined to inherit the new world were naturally the white carpenters and bricklayers, the tram workers and miners who were organizing their trade unions and who voted for the Labour Party. I would no more have thought of discussing politics with a native youth and of inviting him home to play with me or to a meal or asking him to join the Carnarvon football club. The African was on a different plane, hardly human, part of the scene as were dogs and trees and more remotely cows. I had no special feelings about him, not interest, nor hate, no love. He just did not come into my social picture. So completely had I accepted the traditional attitudes of that time. Yes, I believe that this self-analysis by Eddie Roux, the Afrikaner political rebel and scientist, remains today the flat, unvarnished truth for the majority of Afrikaners. No special feelings, not interest, nor hate, nor love. The result of a complete acceptance of traditional attitudes. That passage captures a mind's racial tabula rasa, if you like, in the first decade of the century, about the time, in short, when the Nobel series of prizes was inaugurated. But a slate, no matter how clean, when exposed, once it is exposed to air, fresh or polluted, cannot avoid receiving some impressions. And we are now in the year 1986, that is, after an entire century of such direct, intimate exposure. Eddie Roux, like hundreds, even thousands of his countrymen, soon made rapid strides. His race has produced its list of martyrs in the cause of non-racialism. One remembers, still with a tinge of pain, Ruth First, destroyed by a letter bomb delivered by the long arm of apartheid. There are others, in varying degrees. Andre Brink, Abram Fisher, Helen Suzman, Breton Brettenbach, with the scars of martyrdom still seared into their souls. Intellectuals, writers, scientists, plain working men, politicians, they come to that point where social reality can no longer be observed as a culture on a slide beneath the microscope, nor turned into aesthetic variations on pages, canvas, or the stage. The blacks are, of course, locked into an unambiguous condition. On this occasion, I do not address us. We know, and we embrace our mission. It is the other that this precedent seizes the opportunity to address, and not merely those who are trapped within the confines of that doomed camp which is South Africa, but those who live outside, on the fringes of conscience. Those specifically who with shameless smugness invent arcane moral propositions that enable them to plead inaction in a language of unparalleled political flatulence. Personally, I find sanctions morally repugnant. Or what shall we say of another leader for whom economic sanctions which work against an Eastern European country will not work in the apartheid enclave of South Africa? That master of histrionics who takes to the world's airwaves to sing, "Let Poland be," but turns off his hearing aid when the world shouts, "Let Nicaragua be." But enough of these world leaders of double talk and multiple moralities. It is baffling To any mind that pretends to the slightest claim to rationality, it is truly and formidably baffling. Can the same terrain of phenomenal assimilation, that is, one which has produced such evidence of a capacity to translate empirical observations into implications of rational human conduct, can this same terrain which, over half a century ago, 50 entire years, 2-3 generations ago, produced the Buntings, the Roux, the Douglas Waltons, Solly Sachs, the Gideon Bothas, can that same terrain, 50, 60, 70 years later, be peopled by a species of humanity so ahistorical that the Declaration, so clearly spelt out in 1919 at the burning of the passes, remains only a troublesome event of no enduring significance? Jack Cope has surely summed it up in his foreword to The Adversary Within, a study of dissidence in Africana literature, where he states, looking back from the perspective of the present, I think it can justly be said that at the core of the matter, the Africana leaders in 1924 took the wrong turning. Themselves the victims of imperialism in its most evil aspect, all their sufferings and enormous loss of life nevertheless failed to convey to them the obvious historical lesson. They became themselves the new imperialists. They took over from Britain the mantle of empire and colonialism. They could well have set their faces against annexation, aggression, colonial exploitation and oppression, racial arrogance and barefaced hypocrisy of which they have themselves been the victims. They could have opened the doors to humane ideas and civilizing processes and transformed the great territory with its incalculable resources into another new world. Instead, they deliberately set the clock back wherever they could. Taking over 10 million indigenous subjects from British colonial rule, they stripped them of what limited rights they had gained over a century and tightened the screws on their subjection. We summon the conscience of the world to that suicidal, anachronistic present. We say also to its child, the child of that world, to this mutant present, you are the product of a world's centuries of lies, distortion, and opportunism in high places, even among the holy of holies of scientific objectivity. But the world is growing up, while you willfully remain a child, a stubborn, self-destructive child, with certain destructive powers, but a child nevertheless. I would say to the world, we call attention of the world to its own historic passage of lies, as yet unabandoned by some, which sustains the evil precocity of this child. We demand from that world that is finally coming to itself a measure of expiation, demand that it rescue itself by concrete acts from the stigma of being the willful parent of a monstrosity, especially as that monstrous child still draws material nourishment, breath, and human recognition from the strengths and devices of that world, with an umbilical cord which stretches across oceans, even across the cosmos, via so-called programs of technological cooperation. We're saying very simply, but urgently, sever that cord. By any name, be total sanction, boycott, disinvestment, or whatever, sever this umbilical cord and leave this monster of a birth to atrophy and die, or to rebuild itself on long-denied humane foundations. Let it collapse, shorn of its external nourishment, from its economic lopsided. Let it collapse of its own social disequilibrium, its war of attrition on its most productive labor. Let it wither like an aborted fetus of the human family if it persists in smothering the minds and sinews which constitute its authentic being. This pariah society, that is apartheid South Africa, plays many games on human intelligence. Listen to this, for example. When the whole world escalated its appeal for the release of Nelson Mandela, this government blandly declared that it continued to hold Nelson Mandela for the same reason that the Allied powers continued to hold Rudolf Hess. Now, a statement like that is an obvious appeal to the love of the ridiculous in everyone. Certainly, it wrung some kind of satiric poem out of me, Rudolf Hess as Nelson Mandela in blackface. What else can a writer do to protect his humanity against such egregious assaults? And yet again, to equate Nelson Mandela to the arch criminal, Rudolf Hess, is a macabre improvement on the attitude of regarding him as subhuman. It belongs on that same scale of apartheid self-improvement as the ratio between Sharpeville and Von Brandes Square, that near-kind, near-considerate, almost benevolent dispersal of the first native past rebellion. That world, which is so conveniently traduced by apartheid thought, is of course that which I so wholeheartedly embrace. And this is my choice, among several options, of the significance of my presence here. It's a world that nourishes my being, one which is so self-sufficient, so replete in all aspects of its productivity, so confident in itself and in its destiny, that it experiences no fear in reaching out to others and in responding to the reach of others. It is the heartstone of our creative existence. It constitutes the prison of our world perception, and this means that our sight need not be and has never been permanently turned inwards. If it were, we could not so easily understand the enemy on our doorstep, nor understand how to obtain the means to disarm it. When this society, which is apartheid, South Africa, indulges from time to time in appeals to the outside world that it represents the last bastion of civilization against the hordes of barbarism from the north, we can even afford an indulgent smile. It is sufficient, imagines this state, to raise the specter of a few renegade African leaders, psychopaths, and robber barons, whom we ourselves are victims of, whom we denounce before the world and overthrow when we are able. This apartheid society insists to the world that its picture of the future is a menacing reality which only its policies can erase. There's a continent, they say, which only destroys. It is peopled by a race which has never contributed anything positive to the world's pool of knowledge. A vacuum that will suck into its insatiable maw the entire fruits of centuries of European civilization, then spew out the resulting mush with contempt. How strange that a society which claims to represent this endangered face of progress should itself be locked in centuries-old fantasies, blithely unaware of or indifferent to the fact that it is the last institutionally functioning product of archaic articles of faith in Euro-Judaic thought. Take God and law, for example. Especially the former. The black race has more than sufficient historic justification to be a little paranoid about the intrusion of alien deities into its destiny. For even today, apartheid's mentality of the preordained rests, according to its own unabashed statement, on what I can only describe as incidents in a testamentary godism. I dare not call it Christianity. The sons of Ham, on the one hand, the descendants of Shem on the other. The once pronounced, utterly immutable curse. As for law, these supremacists base their refusal to concede the right of equal political participation to blacks on the claim that Africans have neither respect for nor the slightest proclivity for law, that is, for any arbitrating concept between the individual and the collective. Even the mildest, liberal, somewhat regretful, but contented apologists for apartheid, for at least some form of apartheid, which is not apartheid, but it ensures the status quo, even this ambivalent breed bases its case on this lack of the idea of law in the black mind. I need only refer to a recent contribution to this literature in the form of an autobiography by a famous heart transplant surgeon, one who, in his own scientific right, has probably been a candidate for a Nobel Prize in the sciences. Despite constant intellectual encounters on diverse levels, the sad phenomenon persists of Afrikaner minds which, in the words of Eddie Rue, are products of that complete acceptance of the traditional attitudes of the time. They have, as readily acknowledged, quite respectable intellectual ancestors. Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel, to cite just my favorite example, found it convenient to pretend that the African had not yet developed to the level where he, I quote, attained that realization of any substantial objective existence, as for example, God or law, in which the interest of man's volition is involved and in which he realizes his own being. He continues, this distinction between himself as an individual and the universality of his essential being, the African in the uniform, undeveloped oneness of his existence, has not yet attained, so that the knowledge of absolute being, an other and a higher than his individual self, is entirely wanting. Futile to waste a moment refuting the banal untruthfulness of this claim, I content myself with extracting from it only a lesson which escapes even today those who insist that the pinnacle of man's intellectual thrust is the capacity to project his universality in the direction of a super-other. There is, I believe, a very healthy school of thought which not only opposes this materially, but has produced effectively structured societies which operate independently of this seductive, even productively inspiring, but extravagant fable. Once we thus overcome the temptation to contest the denial of this feat of imaginative projection to the African, we find ourselves left only with the dispassionate exercise of examining in what areas we encounter differences between the histories of societies which, according to Hegel and company, never conceived of this omnipotent extrusion into infinite space, and those who did, be these differences in the areas of economic or artistic life, social relations, or scientific attainment. In short, in all those activities which are empirically verifiable, quite different from the racial consequences of religious implications arising from that post-Adam and Eve nudist escapade in the Old Testament. When we do this, we come upon a curious fact. The pre-colonial history of African societies, and I refer to both Euro-Christian and Arab-Islamic colonization, indicates very clearly that African societies never, at any time of their existence, went to war with another over the issue of their religion. That is, at no time did the black race attempt to subjugate or forcibly convert others with any holier-than-thou evangelizing zeal. Economic and political motives, yes, but not religion. Perhaps it is this unnatural fact which was responsible for the conclusions of Hegel. We do not know. Certainly the bloody histories of the world major religions, localized skirmishes of which extend even to the present, lead to a sneaking suspicion that religion, as defined by these eminent philosophers, comes to self-knowledge only through the activity of war. When therefore, towards the close of the 20th century, that is centuries after the Crusades and the Jihads that laid waste one another's and other civilizations, fragmented ancient cohesive social relations, trampled upon the spirituality of entire peoples, smashing their cultures in obedience to the strictures of unseen gods, when today we encounter nations whose social reasoning is guided by canonical theological claims, we believe on our part that the era of darkness has never truly left the world. A state whose justification for the continuing suppression of its indigents who constitute the majority on that land, rests on claims to divine selection, is a menace to secure global relationships in a world that thrives on rationalism as common denominator. Such a society does not, in other words, belong to the modern world. We also have our myths. We have never employed them as a base for the subjugation of others. We also inhabit a realistic world, however, and for the recovery of the fullness of that world, the black race has no choice but to prepare itself and volunteer the supreme sacrifice. In speaking of that world, both myth and reality, it is our duty, perhaps our very last peaceful duty to a doomed enemy, to remind it and its supporters outside its boundaries that the phenomenon of ambivalence induced by the African world has a very long history, but that most proponents of the slanderous aspects have long ago learned to abandon the untenable. Take the German explorer Leo Frobenius, for example, who was able to visit Ile-Ife, the heartland and cradle of the Yoruba race, and be profoundly stirred an object of beauty, the product of the Yoruba mind and hand, a classic expression of that serene portion of the world resolution of that race. In his own words, before us stood a head of marvelous beauty, wonderfully cast in antique bronze, true to the life, encrusted with a patina of glorious dark green. This was, in very deed, the Olokun, Atlantic Africa's Poseidon. Yet listen to what he had to write about the very people whose handiwork had lifted him into these realms of universal sublimity. He says, profoundly stirred, I stood for many minutes before the remnant of the erstwhile lord and ruler of the empire of Atlantis. My companions were no less astounded. As though we had agreed to do so, we held our peace. Then I looked around and saw the blacks, the circle of the sons of the venerable priest, His Holiness, the Oni's friends, and his intelligent officials. I was moved to silent melancholy at the thought that this assembly of degenerate and feeble-minded posterity should be the legitimate guardians of so much loveliness. There is a deep lesson for the world in the black race's capacity to forgive. One which I often think has much to do with ethical precepts which spring from their worldview and authentic religions, none of which is ever totally eradicated by the accretions of foreign faiths and their implicit ethnocentrisms. It is the same largeness of spirit which has informed the relationship today of erstwhile colonial nations, some of whom have undergone the most cruel forms of settler or plantation colonialism, where human degradation that goes with greed and exploitation attains such levels of perversion that human ears, hands, and noses serve to atone for failure in production quota. Nations which underwent the agony of wars of liberation, whose earth freshly teems with the bodies of innocent victims and unsung martyrs, live side by side today with their recent enslavers, even sharing the control of their destiny with those who barely 4 or 5 years before compelled them to witness the massacres of their kith and kin. Over and beyond the call of Christian charity, they are content to rebuild and to share. It is a phenomenon surely worthy of note. There are, after all, European nations today whose memory of domination by other races remains so vivid, more than 2 centuries after their own liberation, that a terrible vengeance, culturally, socially, and politically, is still exacted, even at this very moment, from the descendants of those erstwhile conquerors. I have visited such nations whose cruel histories under foreign domination are enshrined as icons to daily consciousness in monuments, in parks, museums, and churches. In documentation, woodcuts, photogravures displayed under bulletproof glass cases, but, most telling of all, in the reduction of the remnants of the conquering hordes to the degraded status of aliens and sufferers, with reduced civic rights, privileges, and social status, a barely tolerated marginality that expresses itself in the pathos of downcast faces, drooped shoulders, apologetic encounters in those rare times when intercourse with the latterly assertive race is unavoidable. Yes, all this I have seen, and much of it has been written about and debated in international gatherings. And even while acknowledging the poetic justice of it all in the abstract, one cannot help but wonder if a physical pound of flesh excised at birth would not be a kinder act than a lifelong visitation of the sins of the father on the sons, even to the 10th and 12th generations. Confronted, therefore, with such traditions of attenuating the racial and cultural pride of these marginalized or minority peoples, the mind travels back to our own societies where such causative histories are far fresher in the memory, where the ruins of formerly thriving communities still speak eloquent accusations and fumes still rise from the scorched earth strategies of colonial and racist myopia. Yet the streets bear the names of former oppressors. Their statues, and other symbols of subjugation are left to decorate their squares. The consciousness of a fully confident people having relegated them to mere decorations and roosting places for bats and pigeons. and the libraries remain unpurged, so that new generations freely browse through the works of Frobenius, of Hume, Hegel, Montesquieu, Voltaire, and others, without first encountering, freshly stamped on the fly-leaf, warning, this work is dangerous for your racial self-esteem. But these proofs of accommodation on the grand or minuscule scale, collective, institutional, or individual, must not be taken as proof of an infinite, uncritical capacity of black patience. They constitute in their own nature a body of tests, an accumulation of debt, an implicit offer that must be matched by concrete returns. They are the blocks in a suspended bridge begun from one end of a chasm, which, whether the builders will it or no, must obey the law of matter and crash down after a certain point, settling definitively into the widening chasm of suspicion, frustration, and redoubled hate. On that testing ground, which for us is Southern Africa, that medieval camp of biblical terrors, primitive suspicions, a choice must be made by all lovers of peace. Either to force it into the modern world, into a rational state of being, within that spirit of human partnership, a capacity for which has been so amply demonstrated by every liberated black nation on our continent, or to bring it abjectly to its knees by ejecting it in every aspect from humane recognition, so that it cave in internally through the strategies of its embattled majority. Whatever the choice, this inhuman affront cannot be allowed to pursue our 20th century conscience into the 21st, that symbolic coming of age which peoples of all cultures appear to celebrate with rites of passage. That calendar, we know, is not universal, but time is, and so are the imperatives of time. And all those imperatives which challenge our being, our presence, and our humane definition at this time, none can be considered more pervasive than the end of racism, the eradication of human inequality, and the dismantling of all their structures. The prize is the consequent enthronement of its complement, universal suffrage, and peace. Thank you very much.